"I promise to be slow," the millionaire whispered, and in that moment the young woman's life changed forever. But what is really hiding behind this promise? Tell me, where are you watching this video from? If you want to discover this forbidden love story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. The story is just beginning. The white dress trembled as she stepped back, her eyes wide before the man who had just whispered words that made her heart race uncontrollably. Never in her 22 years of innocent life had she felt anything like this. That mixture of fear and curiosity that sent shivers across every inch of her skin. There he stood, imposing in his dark suit that probably cost more than everything she owned, with those deep eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. Sometimes the simplest words are the ones that alter the course of our lives, like rivers changing their path after an unexpected storm. "I promise to go slowly," he repeated, extending his hand with a gentleness that completely contrasted with the raw masculinity emanating from his entire being. Eleanor Harlow felt time stop in that moment. The murmur of conversations in the office, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant ringing of phones. Everything faded before the intensity of that gaze. Griffin Lancaster, the feared CEO of Nexus Technology, the man the media had dubbed the lone wolf of American innovation, was showing a vulnerability that contradicted every rumor about his ruthless personality. What neither of them could imagine was that this promise would transform not only their individual lives, but would fundamentally alter who they were as people. That this moment, seemingly insignificant in the vast tapestry of the universe, would contain the seeds of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, power, and redemption. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly when she finally dared to take the hand he offered. The contact was electric, a silent discharge that ran through their bodies like an encrypted message only their hearts could interpret. "What if I don't know how to follow your pace?" she asked, with that disconcerting honesty that characterized her. An unexpected smile illuminated Griffin's usually serious face, transforming it completely. "Then I'll stop until we're ready to walk together," he responded with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "I've spent my entire life running, Eleanor. It's time I learned to enjoy the scenery." The bustle of New York filtered through the wide windows of the skyscraper, reminding them that an entire world existed beyond the bubble they had just created, a world that would try, with all its might, to separate them. But in that instant, with their hands intertwined and their gazes connected, the future seemed a brilliant possibility rather than a threat. What neither knew was that this moment of connection was just the first step of a journey that would take them from the glass offices of Manhattan to the endless fields of rural Virginia. A journey that would begin with a simple promise, spoken in a whisper, but that would resonate with the force of an ancestral oath. 6 months earlier, Eleanor Harlow had crossed the glass doors of Nexus Technology with a racing heart and sweaty palms. The skyscraper rose like a needle of glass and steel in the heart of New York's financial district, so different from the landscapes of rural Virginia that had been her home her entire life. The smell of expensive coffee and exclusive perfumes had replaced the aroma of the mountains and fresh-baked bread that permeated the small family store in Millwood. Her hands, once accustomed to helping her grandmother Vivian prepare homemade pies and serve slices of country ham to customers, now held a resume printed on premium paper that had consumed almost an entire day's salary from her waitressing job. The interview for the personal assistant position was her only opportunity to change the course of her life and her family's. "Are you 3 minutes late?" was the cutting greeting from the Human Resources Director, a woman whose face seemed to have forgotten how to smile. Griffin Lancaster doesn't like tardiness. Eleanor swallowed hard, feeling her hopes evaporate like morning dew under the relentless August sun. "I'm sorry, the subway," she began to explain, but was interrupted by an impatient gesture. "Excuses. Successful people don't make excuses, they find solutions." For the next hour, Eleanor answered increasingly difficult questions, trying to hide her Virginia accent that revealed her rural origins. Each response seemed inadequate, each gesture too nervous. When she finally stood to leave, the director stopped her with a final question. "Why should we hire you when we have candidates from the best private universities?" Eleanor felt something break inside her. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was the liberation that comes from understanding she had nothing to lose. "Because while they were studying theory, I was learning about real life," she responded with surprising calm. "Because I've supported 3 younger siblings since my father abandoned us when I was 10. Because I know the value of hard work and loyalty better than anyone in this room." The silence that followed seemed to contain the weight of the entire universe. To her astonishment, a week later, she received the call. The position was hers. What Eleanor didn't know then was that Griffin Lancaster, hidden in an adjoining room during all the interviews, had heard her response and recognized in her something he believed lost in the corporate world: authenticity. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in a minimalist penthouse overlooking Central Park, Griffin Lancaster contemplated the New York sunset with an untouched whiskey in hand. At 38, he had built a technological empire from scratch, turning an idea born in a small shared apartment in Boston into a company valued in the millions. His decisions moved markets, his words could make competitors tremble, his signature on a contract meant guaranteed success. And yet, as he watched families strolling through the park, he felt that familiar emptiness expanding inside him. An emptiness that no corporate acquisition, no professional recognition, no bulging bank account had ever managed to fill. Griffin's solitude wasn't accidental. It was a fortress carefully built after years of disappointments. From that first girlfriend who had used him to climb the corporate ladder, to the partner who had nearly ruined him by betraying him for money, each experience had added a new brick to the wall protecting his heart. He had convinced himself that the price of success was solitude, that vulnerability was weakness, that trust was exposing oneself to betrayal. His phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from his HR assistant. "Selected candidates for your final review attached." Griffin opened the file and distractedly scanned the profiles until a photograph caught his attention. It wasn't the most professional nor the best lit, but there was something in that young woman's gaze that made him pause. Sincere eyes that contrasted with the rehearsed smiles of the other candidates. Eleanor Harlow, 22 years old, Virginia. Griffin enlarged her resume. No studies at prestigious universities, no master's degrees abroad, no internships at multinationals. Only real experience in family businesses, night courses while working during the day, and a letter of recommendation from a literature professor who highlighted her extraordinary ability to connect with people and see what others overlook. Something in that description resonated deeply with him. He remembered his own beginnings, when he was just a skinny boy from a working-class neighborhood in Boston, with patched clothes and worn sneakers, but with a determination that frightened even his teachers. "Hire her," he told his assistant when she called to confirm. "I want to see her in action." What Griffin couldn't imagine was that this decision, made almost by instinct, would forever alter the course of his life. That this young woman with clear eyes and hard-working hands would bring to his perfectly controlled existence the wonderful chaos of true love. The first real encounter between them occurred 3 weeks after Eleanor began working at Nexus. Until then, he had only seen her from afar, observing how she adapted with surprising speed to the frenetic pace of the company. Her efficiency was undeniable, but what most caught Griffin's attention was her authenticity. In a world where everyone wore masks, she presented herself exactly as she was. That morning, Griffin had called a crucial meeting with international investors. Confidential documents, financial projections, secret prototypes, everything had to be perfectly organized. His usual assistant had fallen ill, and at the last minute Eleanor was assigned to replace her. Nexus's main conference room was intimidating by design. Glass walls offering a panoramic view of New York, a black oak table that could have served for international summits, and cutting-edge technology discreetly integrated into every surface. It was a setting created to impress and at times to intimidate. Eleanor entered carrying a tray with coffee cups and a stack of folders that barely allowed her to see where she was walking. Nervousness made her legs feel like jelly. She was just a few steps from the table when it happened. She tripped on the almost imperceptible edge of a designer rug. Time seemed to slow down as the hot coffee flew through the air in a perfect parabola, landing precisely on the folders containing the meticulously prepared documents. The silence that followed was absolute, as if even the air conditioning were holding its breath. The executives present exchanged uncomfortable looks, expecting the explosion of fury that would surely follow. Griffin's reputation as a relentless perfectionist was legendary. Stories about assistants fired for minor errors circulated like urban myths through the company corridors. Eleanor felt the world crumbling beneath her feet. In a matter of seconds, her mind calculated all the consequences: immediate dismissal, shame, returning to Millwood with her tail between her legs, the impossibility of helping her siblings. "I'm so sorry," she stammered with a broken voice, kneeling to try to save the soaked documents. She expected shouting, contempt, public humiliation. What she didn't expect was for Griffin Lancaster, the feared CEO, to kneel beside her in his custom-made Italian suit. "It happens to the best of us," he said with surprising tranquility, taking a silk handkerchief from his pocket to help dry the papers. Their fingers brushed briefly as they tried to rescue a particularly important graph, and Eleanor felt an inexplicable shiver run down her spine. She raised her gaze and found Griffin's eyes, observing her with an expression she couldn't decipher. There was no anger, but a kind of curiosity, as if he were discovering something unexpected. "Mr. Lancaster, it's not necessary for you to—" began one of the executives, visibly uncomfortable with the scene. "We all need help sometimes," Griffin interrupted, without taking his eyes off Eleanor. "Nobody is infallible." That simple gesture, that unexpected show of humanity, created a crack in the armor Eleanor had built to survive in this unfamiliar world. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she also noticed something different in the gaze of this man, a gentleness that didn't match all the terrible stories she had heard about him. When they finally stood, Griffin gave her a smile that completely transformed his face, softening the hard angles of his features and revealing a younger, more vulnerable version of himself. "I have digital copies of everything," he confided in a low voice as the executives retook their seats. "I always have a plan B." And then, surprising everyone present, he added, "Miss Harlow, I'd like you to stay for the meeting. Your perspective might be refreshing." What Griffin didn't say, what perhaps he didn't even admit to himself at that moment, was that something in this young woman had awakened a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. A spark of genuine interest in a life that had become predictable and, in a way, empty despite all his achievements. Eleanor nodded, astonished, and took a seat in the farthest corner of the table. For the next 2 hours, she observed Griffin conduct the meeting masterfully, disarming objections with precise data, inspiring confidence with strategic vision, closing deals with a perfect mixture of firmness and diplomacy. But what impressed her most was realizing that, on several occasions during the presentation, Griffin sought her gaze, as if he wanted to check her reaction, as if her opinion, that of a simple temporary assistant without experience, had some value to him. When the meeting ended after everyone had left, Griffin called her to his office. Eleanor's heart raced wildly as she walked down the glass corridor that led to the CEO's office, convinced that now, in private, would come the reprimand she had avoided in public. "What did you think of the meeting?" he asked, surprising her again. "Excuse me? Your opinion? About the meeting, about the project, about the investors? I want to know what you thought." Eleanor hesitated, but something in Griffin's expectant expression encouraged her to be honest. "I think the German investor wasn't completely convinced by the expansion strategy into Latin America," she said finally, "and the Japanese representative seemed more interested in the technology than in the numbers." An expression of genuine astonishment crossed Griffin's face. "Exactly the same observations I made," he admitted. "How did you know?" Eleanor shrugged. "My grandmother says I have a gift for reading people. In the family store, I always knew who needed a friendly ear and who just wanted to eat in peace." For the first time in years, Griffin let out a sincere laugh that surprised even himself, a laugh that emerged from a place he thought forgotten, an echo of the boy he had been before the world hardened him. "I think you just earned yourself a promotion, Eleanor Harlow," he said, and this time his smile reached his eyes. What neither of them knew at that moment was that the spilled coffee had been the catalyst for something much deeper than a professional promotion. It was the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and about love. The following weeks became a strange dance. Griffin began to find pretexts to be near Eleanor. He needed her to review contracts late at night, requested her opinion on projects she barely understood, invented meetings that could have easily been emails. Eleanor, for her part, discovered she enjoyed watching him work. She was fascinated by the way he gestured when explaining his ideas, how his eyes gained a special gleam when talking about innovation, the barely contained passion he showed for projects that could change lives. But what intrigued her most were those fleeting moments when the mask of the powerful businessman slipped, revealing the vulnerable man hidden behind it. One night, while they were working in his office reviewing the presentation for a technology conference in Chicago, Eleanor noticed an old photograph on Griffin's desk. She had seen it before but had never dared to ask about it. The image showed a thin, serious boy, with visibly patched clothes, holding the hand of a woman with a tired but dignified expression. "My mother," said Griffin, surprising her by noticing her interest. He used a tone laden with emotion. "She worked to exhaustion to give me an education in Boston. I never saw her rest for a single day." There was such vulnerability in his voice that Eleanor felt a knot in her throat. Without thinking, she extended her hand and touched his briefly. To her surprise, Griffin didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his palm up and intertwined his fingers with hers in a gesture so intimate it felt like a confession. "What was she like?" Eleanor asked softly. The question opened a floodgate. For the next hour, Griffin spoke as he hadn't in years. He told her about his childhood in a working-class neighborhood in Boston, about how his mother cleaned other people's houses during the day and sewed for a textile factory at night, about the silent sacrifices she had made so he could study computer science. "She died a month before I secured my first significant investment," he confessed with a broken voice. She never got to see what her sacrifice turned into. That night, under the cold light of Manhattan's skyscrapers, the barriers between boss and employee, between different social worlds, began to blur. Griffin told her about his ex-fiancée, who had used him to climb positions, about friends who disappeared when he lost everything in a risky investment years ago, about how rebuilding his empire had left him emptier than ever. Eleanor, in turn, told him about the father who left when she was 10, leaving her mother with 4 children and a family store on the brink of ruin. She talked about the daily struggle to keep the family together, about how she had to temporarily abandon her studies to help when her mother fell ill, about dreams she kept in a box at the bottom of her heart because they seemed too ambitious for someone like her. "What's in that box?" Griffin asked, genuinely interested. "What do you dream about when no one is watching?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure about sharing something so personal. But the intimacy of the moment, the vulnerability Griffin had shown, gave her courage. "I've always wanted to create something that connects people," she confessed. "A platform that would allow rural communities like mine to share their traditions, their knowledge, their products, something that would build bridges between worlds that rarely touch." Griffin observed her with an intensity that made her cheeks flush. "It's a brilliant idea," he said finally, "and absolutely viable." "Do you really think so?" she asked, surprised that he took seriously what she had always considered an unattainable fantasy. "I think you underestimate your potential, Eleanor Harlow," he responded, with a smile that illuminated his usually serious eyes. "And that's something we need to remedy." That conversation marked a before and after. In the days that followed, Griffin began to share project drafts with her, request her opinion on strategic decisions, include her in meetings normally reserved for high executives. Some in the company whispered, questioning the meteoric rise of the country girl, insinuating favoritism or something worse. The tension exploded when Eleanor accidentally overheard 2 female directors talking in the bathroom. "It's obvious what's going on," one of them said with disdain. "The country girl found her golden goose. I wonder what special services she's providing the boss." The words hit her like a physical slap. It wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice because of her origin, but hearing her work, her effort, her intelligence reduced to vulgar insinuations, caused her a pain she hadn't expected. That afternoon, with reddened eyes and broken determination, she drafted her resignation letter. She was placing it on Griffin's desk when he unexpectedly entered. "What's this?" he asked, taking the envelope. "My resignation," she responded with a firm voice, despite the knot in her throat. "I think it's best for everyone." Griffin read the letter with an indecipherable expression. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes that Eleanor had never seen before, a mixture of pain and fierce determination. "Is this what you really want?" he asked with a tense voice. "Or are you running away because it's easier than facing what's happening between us?" The question hung in the air like an invisible thread that connected and separated them simultaneously. A question neither of them was completely prepared to answer. The first major turning point came the following day. Without prior notice, Griffin called a mandatory general meeting for all staff. Nexus's main auditorium, with capacity for 500 people, filled with nervous murmurs. These meetings only occurred for transcendental announcements, major acquisitions, mass layoffs, dramatic restructurings. Eleanor sat in the last row, trying to go unnoticed. She had temporarily withdrawn her resignation at Griffin's request, but remained convinced that leaving was the most sensible option. The rumors, the looks, the insinuations, everything had become unbearable. Griffin took the stage with his usual imposing presence. Impeccable suit, perfect posture, indecipherable expression. But there was something different about him that day, a contained energy that Eleanor could perceive even from a distance. "Good morning, everyone," he began with a clear voice that resonated in the silent auditorium. "I've called you here to make two important announcements." The first announcement was about the creation of a new division within Nexus, Rural Connections, an ambitious project to digitize and connect remote communities with global markets. To everyone's surprise, especially Eleanor's, Griffin revealed that the original idea came from a young woman from Virginia who understood something that all of us, with our masters and doctorates, had overlooked, that true innovation emerges when we build bridges between different worlds. A murmur ran through the room, as all eyes turned to Eleanor, whose cheeks burned with embarrassment and emotion. But it was the second announcement that left the auditorium completely astounded. Miss Eleanor Harlow will assume the position of Deputy Director of Social Innovation, reporting directly to me, Griffin declared with firmness. Her unique perspective and extraordinary ability to understand real human needs has proven invaluable to Nexus. During the last 3 months, she has developed ideas that have increased our productivity by 40%, identified opportunities we had all overlooked, and brought to this company something we were losing: humanity. The silence that followed was so dense it could have been cut with a knife. Slowly, some began to applaud. Others remained still, shocked or indignant. But Griffin wasn't finished. His voice acquired a deeper, almost dangerous tone. "I also want to make something very clear. At Nexus, we value talent and innovation. We do not tolerate pettiness, malicious rumors, or any behavior that undermines our culture of respect. If anyone has doubts about the capability or merit of any member of our team, my door is open for discussions based on data and concrete facts. Corridor rumors are for mediocre companies. And Nexus is not mediocre." When the meeting ended, Eleanor remained seated, unable to move. Emotions collided within her: gratitude, confusion, fear, hope, and something deeper she didn't dare to name. Griffin found her there, motionless in the empty auditorium. "You should have consulted me," she said finally. "I'm not prepared for a position like this." He sat beside her, surprisingly relaxed after the earthquake he had just provoked in the company's power structure. "Nobody is born prepared for anything important, Eleanor," he responded calmly. "I was 24 and living in a shared apartment with leaks when I founded this company. I was terrified every day, convinced someone would discover I had no idea what I was doing. But this is different," she insisted. "People will think it's because of something between us." Griffin looked at her directly, with an intensity that made her heart race. "And is there something between us, Eleanor?" The question hung in the air, laden with possibilities and dangers. Eleanor felt she was at the edge of an invisible precipice, knowing her answer would forever alter the course of her life. "I don't know," she responded with honesty. "And that terrifies me." Griffin nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he already knew. "Me too," he confessed, and that admission of vulnerability from a man the world considered unstoppable was more intimate than any grandiose declaration. "That's how I know it's real. Fear always accompanies the things that truly matter." That afternoon, Eleanor accepted the position and the responsibility it entailed. Not for Griffin, she told herself, but because for the first time, someone believed in her ideas, in her potential, in her value beyond her origin or circumstances. What she couldn't foresee was that this decision would trigger a series of events that would test not only her professional capacity, but also the depth of her feelings and the strength of her character. The second major turning point came 2 weeks later, in the form of a phone call that shattered Eleanor's newly found stability. Her youngest brother, Mason, called in the middle of an important meeting. Grandmother Vivian, the pillar of the Harlow family, had collapsed while tending the store. The initial diagnosis was concerning: possible stroke. Eleanor rushed out of the boardroom, forgetting protocols and formalities. Tears blurred her vision as she tried to book the first available flight to Virginia. Her hands trembled so much she could barely operate the app on her phone. That's how Griffin found her, huddled in a corner of the break room, fighting against panic and helplessness. "My grandmother," was all she could articulate before a new sob shook her body. No more words were necessary. Griffin took the phone from her trembling hands and with a calm but authoritative voice made a call. "I need the corporate jet ready in 30 minutes, he ordered. "Destination, Dulles International, and I want Dr. Thompson from Mount Sinai contacted immediately. Tell him it's personal." Eleanor looked at him in astonishment, unable to process what was happening. "I can't accept—" She began to protest. "You can, and you will," he interrupted with firmness. "Your grandmother needs immediate attention, not in 4 hours when the flight arrives." An hour later they were flying over the Appalachian Mountains. Eleanor gazed out the window, still in shock at the speed with which Griffin had mobilized resources that, to her, were inconceivable. Dr. Thompson, one of the most prestigious neurologists in the country, was already on his way to Virginia on another private flight. "Why are you doing all this?" she finally asked, turning toward Griffin, who was working silently on his tablet. He looked up and for a moment seemed vulnerable, almost uncertain. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone fundamental and feel powerless," he responded with simplicity. "I couldn't save my mother. Maybe I can help save your grandmother." The raw honesty of his response left Eleanor speechless. For the first time, she clearly saw the man behind the ruthless businessman, someone who had experienced profound losses and who, despite all his power and wealth, still carried those scars. The small regional hospital in Millwood had never seen anything like it. Within hours, specialized equipment was transported. Specialists were consulted via video conference, and Grandmother Vivian received care that was normally only available in the best private medical centers in New York or Boston. While the doctors worked, the Harlow family gathered in the small waiting room. Eleanor's 3 younger siblings observed Griffin with a mixture of amazement and distrust. For them, men in expensive suits had always been distant figures who signed evictions or denied loans. "He's your boss, right?" asked Adelaide, the 16-year-old sister, with barely disguised suspicion. "Why would he do all this for an employee's grandmother?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications Eleanor wasn't prepared to address. It was then that Griffin surprised them all. He removed his suit jacket, rolled up his shirt sleeves and asked where the family store was located. "The store?" repeated Caleb, the 19-year-old brother, confused. "Yes, someone should keep it open while we wait, right?" Griffin responded with naturalness. "Your grandmother wouldn't want to lose a day of business." And so Griffin Lancaster, CEO of one of the most important technology companies in America, spent the afternoon serving slices of homemade pie and local apple cider to the bewildered inhabitants of a small town in Virginia. His hands, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, now cut bread, washed glasses, and served country ham with a skill that surprised everyone. "I worked as a waiter to pay for my studies," he explained when Caleb asked him where he had learned. "In a pub near the university in Boston." Eleanor observed him from the kitchen, where she prepared more food following the recipes her grandmother had taught her since childhood. There was something surreal about the whole situation, but also something deeply moving. Seeing Griffin interact with regular customers, listening to their stories with genuine interest, laughing at local jokes he barely understood, it was as if a new dimension of him was revealing itself before her eyes. When they closed the store, past midnight, they returned to the hospital to receive hopeful news. Grandmother Vivian was stable. The early and specialized treatment had minimized the damage. She would need rehabilitation, but the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. Relief brought with it exhaustion. The younger siblings fell asleep in the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room. Eleanor and Griffin went out to the hospital's small terrace to breathe fresh air. Under the starry Virginia sky, so different from the urban glow of New York, they remained silent for a long time. "Thank you," Eleanor finally said, feeling the words were completely inadequate to express the depth of her gratitude. "I don't know how I can—" "Don't say that," he gently interrupted. "You don't owe me anything. But all this, the doctors, the jet, your time, some things have no price, Eleanor," he responded, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet night. "What I did today wasn't out of obligation or expecting compensation. I did it because I care about you. Because your pain is my pain." Those simple but profound words broke something inside Eleanor. The emotions contained throughout the day, fear, relief, exhaustion, gratitude, overflowed in silent tears that slid down her cheeks. Without thinking, Griffin drew her to him, enveloping her in an embrace that offered consolation, security, and something more. Something neither of them was prepared to name yet. "My grandmother says you truly know people in moments of crisis," Eleanor murmured against his chest. "Today I truly knew you, Griffin." He gently rested his chin on top of her head, allowing himself to close his eyes and surrender to the sensation of having her in his arms. "Perhaps I also knew myself today," he admitted with an honesty that surprised even himself. That night, under the stars of Virginia, both understood that what was being born between them transcended conventional labels. It wasn't simply attraction or affection or desire. It was a mutual recognition of souls that, against all odds, had found each other in the vast chaos of the universe. What neither could imagine was that this newly discovered connection would soon face tests that would push its strength to the limit. Grandmother Vivian recovered gradually, exceeding medical expectations with the same tenacity that had characterized her entire life. 3 weeks after the incident, she was already insisting on supervising the store's kitchen from her wheelchair, giving precise orders about the exact amount of cinnamon that should go into each apple pie. Eleanor had requested to work remotely from Millwood during this period, hoping that Nexus would approve a couple weeks of telecommuting. To her surprise, Griffin not only agreed, but implemented a pilot program of connected rural offices, using precisely her situation as a case study. "It's perfect for testing the rural connections concept," he explained during a video call. "We're transforming a personal challenge into an innovation opportunity. That's how a room on the upper floor of the Harlow store was transformed into an ultra-modern office. Technicians sent from New York installed high-speed connections, state-of-the-art video conference equipment, and systems that allowed Eleanor to participate in meetings as if she were physically present at headquarters. What Eleanor didn't expect was for Griffin to appear personally every Friday, supposedly to supervise the pilot project. He arrived in a discreet car. He had stopped using the jet after neighbors complained about the noise, dressed casually instead of in his usual formal suits. The first Friday, Grandmother Vivian observed him with narrowed eyes as he sat uncomfortably in the small family living room. "So you're the famous boss," she finally said, with her Virginia accent more pronounced than usual. "The man who sends doctors on private jets as if he were sending flowers." Griffin blushed slightly, something Eleanor had never seen in New York. "I just did what anyone would have done," he responded with modesty. The elderly woman let out a hoarse laugh. "Young man, I've lived 83 years. I know the difference between what anyone would do and the extraordinary." Her eyes, lively despite her age and recent illness, fixed on his. "The question is, why?" The room sank into a tense silence. Eleanor's siblings, who pretended not to be listening from the kitchen, held their breath. Eleanor herself felt her heart accelerate as she waited for the answer. Griffin held the old woman's gaze without hesitation. "Because your granddaughter has taught me that there are things more valuable than money or power," he responded, with a sincerity that surprised everyone present. "And because I know what it means to lose someone irreplaceable." Grandmother Vivian nodded slowly, as if she had just confirmed a suspicion. "Well," she said finally, "now come help me in the kitchen. I want to teach you how to make a real Virginia apple butter." That was the beginning of a gradual but profound transformation. With each weekend, Griffin immersed himself more in the life of the Harlow family. He learned to play cards with Caleb, helped Adelaide with her math homework, took Mason, the youngest, fishing in the river. Little by little, the feared businessman gave way to the man behind him, a man who laughed more openly, who allowed himself moments of vulnerability, who let fall the armor he had built over years. For Eleanor, seeing him interact with her family was like discovering a new facet of him each day. She was surprised by his patience in listening to her grandmother's endless stories about the Great Depression, his humility in receiving instructions on how to properly prepare pie crust, his genuine enthusiasm when trying traditional recipes. One afternoon, while everyone was napping and the Virginia heat made any activity impossible, Eleanor and Griffin escaped to a nearby field. Under the shade of an ancient oak tree, lying on an improvised blanket, they talked for hours about dreams, fears, hopes. "I never thought I could feel so at peace," Griffin confessed, contemplating the sky visible through the leaves. "In New York, I'm always alert, always prepared for the next attack, the next crisis, the next negotiation." "And here?" Eleanor asked, observing his relaxed profile. "Here I can simply be," he responded with a smile that completely transformed his face. "Without expectations, without hidden agendas, without masks." Eleanor felt an irrepressible impulse, and before she could think too much, leaned in and brushed her lips against his in a kiss as soft as the flutter of a butterfly's wings. Griffin remained still for an instant, as if fearing any movement might break the spell. Then, with infinite delicacy, he cradled Eleanor's face between his hands and returned her kiss with a tenderness that contrasted with the intensity simmering beneath the surface. When they separated, both looked at each other with a mixture of amazement and recognition, as if they had just discovered something precious and fragile. "I'm afraid," Eleanor admitted, "our worlds are so different." "Perhaps not as different as we thought," he responded, caressing her cheek. "Perhaps we just needed to build a bridge." During the following months, that bridge strengthened with each visit, each conversation, each shared moment. Eleanor returned to New York with her grandmother now recovered, but something fundamental had changed. Her relationship with Griffin, though discreet in the work environment, had blossomed into something neither of them had expected to find. The Rural Connections project expanded beyond Virginia, bringing technology and opportunities to forgotten towns in Appalachia, Native American reservations in the Southwest, and small producers across the country. Eleanor directed the program with passion and first-hand knowledge, while Griffin provided resources and strategic vision. Together, they were creating something that transcended simple business success. But the third major turning point was about to arrive in the form of a proposal that would test everything they had built. The proposal arrived in an elegant envelope with the official seal of Global Tech Consortium, the technology giant based in San Francisco. Griffin found it on his desk one October morning, alongside his usual coffee. The content was as extraordinary as it was unexpected. An offer to acquire Nexus technology for an astronomical figure, accompanied by a proposal for Griffin to join the International Board of Directors. The only condition, he would have to relocate to Silicon Valley for at least 3 years to oversee the integration of the companies and develop new strategic projects. In purely business terms, it was the perfect culmination of everything he had built since that small, leaky apartment in Boston. The definitive recognition, the final validation, success in its purest and most tangible form. Griffin remained motionless in his office for hours, contemplating the New York skyline while the battle raged within him. Just a year ago, he would have signed without thinking twice. Now the decision seemed to tear him apart. That night, he cancelled an important dinner with investors and drove to the modest apartment Eleanor had recently rented in Brooklyn. He found her watering the plants on her small balcony, humming an old Virginia folk song her grandmother had taught her. Seeing her like this, with her hair casually tied back and wearing a simple worn t-shirt, Griffin felt a pang of certainty. No corporate success, no bank figure could ever compare to the peace he felt simply being near her. Something's happened. It wasn't a question. Eleanor could read him like an open book. Griffin showed her the letter and observed how her eyes widened, seeing the numbers, the terms, the implications. When she finished reading, she looked up at him with an indescribable emotion. "It's an incredible opportunity," she finally said, with a voice that tried to remain steady. "Everything you've always worked to achieve." "It would mean California," he responded, searching in her eyes for something that might help him make a decision. 3 years, minimum. The silence between them grew dense, heavy with unspoken words, with painful possibilities. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked. Griffin took a step toward her, taking her hands in his. "That depends," he responded with a grave voice. "Would you come with me?" The question hung in the air between them like crystal about to shatter. Eleanor felt her world wobble. abandoning the East Coast, leaving her family, her recently recovered grandmother, the Rural Connections project that had just begun to bear fruit. It was asking too much. "I can't." The words emerged as a painful whisper. "My family, Grandma, our project, everything is here." Griffin nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "I understand. What will you do?" she asked, fearing the answer. "I don't know," he admitted, and the vulnerable honesty in his voice made Eleanor's heart contract. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a strategic plan." The following days were agony for both of them. Griffin immersed himself in endless meetings, analyzing the offer from every possible angle. His advisors were euphoric, pressuring him to accept what they considered the opportunity of the decade. Eleanor, meanwhile, tried to concentrate on her work, pretending everything was fine while uncertainty consumed her. The fourth major turning point came in the most unexpected way. Griffin had scheduled a crucial video conference with global tech executives. Everything was prepared. The preliminary documents, the presentations, the financial analyses. It was the final step before the definitive decision. Minutes before the call, he received a message from Caleb, Eleanor's brother. "Grandma's had a relapse. We're at the regional hospital. Eleanor is devastated." Without thinking twice, Griffin cancelled the video conference. Ignoring the protests of his advisors and the urgent calls from investors, he got in his car and drove at full speed toward Virginia. When he arrived at the small regional hospital, he found the Harlow family gathered in the same waiting room where they had been months ago. Eleanor, with a pale face and red eyes, rose in surprise seeing him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, incredulous. "Your meeting with Silicon Valley—" "It doesn't matter," he responded simply, taking her in his arms without caring who might see them. "This is the only thing that matters." During the following hours, Griffin again mobilized resources, contacted specialists, arranged transfers, but this time, science and money faced a more powerful adversary: time. Grandmother Vivian, at 83, had suffered a massive heart attack that her weakened body couldn't overcome. In the hospital room, surrounded by her family and with Griffin present as one of them, the elderly woman asked to speak with the businessman alone. When everyone left, she took his hand with a surprising strength for someone so fragile. "Promise me you'll take care of her," she said without preamble, with the direct frankness of someone who knows they don't have time for circumlocutions. "My Eleanor is strong, but she's also stubborn. Sometimes she'll need someone to remind her that it's permitted to be happy." Griffin nodded with a knot in his throat. "I promise." The old woman smiled weakly. "And one more thing. Promise you won't let the store close. 5 generations of Harlows have served the best apple pie in Virginia in that place. It would be a shame if it ended up turned into one of those modern cafes that serve coffee in paper cups." Despite the gravity of the moment, Griffin couldn't help but smile. "You have my word, Mrs. Harlow." The grandmother passed away peacefully that night, holding the hands of her grandchildren, and with the satisfaction of one who has lived a full life and left a valuable legacy. The funeral was a celebration of her life as much as a farewell. The entire town came to honor a woman who had been part of the very fabric of the community for more than 8 decades. Griffin remained discreetly at Eleanor's side, offering silent support, respecting the intimacy of her grief. That night, seated in the store's backyard under a starry sky that seemed closer and brighter than in New York, Eleanor rested her head on Griffin's shoulder. "She liked you, you know," she said softly. "She said you had good timber under that expensive suit." Griffin smiled, remembering the endless conversations with the elderly woman in the store's kitchen, her merciless critiques of his technique for rolling pie dough, her insistence that he learn to distinguish a good Virginia bourbon. "She was an extraordinary woman," he responded with sincerity. "Now I understand where you come from." The silence that followed was full of complex emotions, pain for the loss, gratitude for the memories, and the growing certainty that they were at an inflection point. "I've made a decision about the offer," Griffin finally said. Eleanor held her breath, preparing herself for the pain she knew would come with his departure. "I've refused it," he continued, his voice calm but firm. "Completely." "What?" Eleanor straightened up, looking at him in disbelief. "But it's the opportunity of your life, your dream." "No," he gently interrupted. "It was my dream before I met you, before understanding that there are things no amount of money can buy." He took her by the hands, looking directly into her eyes. I've spent 20 years chasing something I believed would make me happy, only to discover that true happiness was in places I hadn't even considered looking. In a family store in Virginia, in a conversation under ancient oak trees, in your smile when you talk about your dreams, the words hung in the night air, laden with meaning and promise. "But your company, your life in New York," she protested weakly. "We can build something new," he responded, with the certainty of one who has finally found his true north, something that combines the best of both worlds, something that truly matters. That night, under the stars of Virginia and with the memory of Grandmother Vivian enveloping them like a silent blessing, they sealed a wordless pact, a commitment to navigate together the storms that would come, to build bridges between their very different worlds, to discover that true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about seeing someone perfectly with all their imperfections. The following months were a period of profound transformation for both. After Grandmother Vivian's funeral, Eleanor immersed herself in work as a mechanism to deal with the pain. The Rural Connections project became her obsession, a way to honor her grandmother's legacy by connecting traditional communities with modern opportunities. Griffin, for his part, faced the consequences of his decision. The rejection of Global Tech's offer provoked an earthquake in New York's business circles. Shareholders questioned his judgment. The board of directors demanded explanations. The media speculated about hidden problems at Nexus. One particularly difficult morning, after a tense meeting with discontented investors, Griffin found an unexpected message on his phone. It was a photograph of a sunrise over the Virginia countryside, with a simple note from Eleanor. "Sometimes the less traveled path offers the most beautiful views." That small show of support gave him the strength he needed to continue forward with his vision, despite the pressures and doubts. The fifth turning point came from where they least expected. Coincidentally, one of the small artisanal honey producers connected through the Rural Connections program had developed a traditional method to produce gourmet honey that caught the attention of an international distributor. Suddenly, what had begun as a social responsibility project became an unexpected business opportunity. Other similar connections began to flourish. Textile artisans from Kentucky finding markets in Japan, apple cider producers from New Hampshire receiving orders from Michelin-starred chefs, and ceramic artisans from the Southwest collaborating with Scandinavian designers. The unexpected success validated Eleanor's vision and Griffin's bet. What critics had dismissed as a romantic whim was proving to be an innovative and profitable business strategy. One afternoon, while reviewing the surprisingly positive results of the project's first quarter, Griffin made a proposal that surprised Eleanor. "I think we should establish Rural Connections headquarters in Millwood," he said naturally, as if he weren't suggesting something revolutionary. "In Millwood?" Eleanor looked at him incredulously. "But all our operations are in New York. The infrastructure, the teams—" "Precisely," he responded with a smile. "What better way to demonstrate that we truly believe in decentralization than to practice it ourselves?" The idea was audacious, almost reckless, but it had an undeniable logic. If they truly believed in connecting the rural with the urban, in building bridges between tradition and innovation, why not start by reimagining the company's own structure? Thus began an ambitious project, the transformation of the old Harlow store and several adjacent buildings into a center for rural innovation. The locations would maintain their traditional exterior appearance, honoring the local architecture and history, while the interior would house cutting-edge technology. For Eleanor, the project had special significance. It was a way to keep her grandmother's spirit alive while building something completely new. Each decision, from the preservation of certain historical elements to the implementation of sustainable solutions, reflected this duality. Griffin, meanwhile, divided his time between New York, where he continued directing Nexus's principal operations, and Millwood, where he personally supervised the evolution of the new center. The constant coming and going was exhausting, but for the first time in his life, he felt his work had a purpose that transcended numbers and balance sheets. The sixth turning point came when they least expected it, in the form of a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had built. An investigative report published in a major national newspaper revealed that one of Nexus's founding partners had been diverting funds to personal accounts in tax havens. Although Griffin wasn't implicated, The shadow of doubt extended over the entire company. The stock plummeted, clients began cancelling contracts, and the Rural Connections project, still in its consolidation phase, was in danger of being reduced or completely eliminated. Griffin received the news while supervising construction in Millwood. His financial director's call was clear. They needed to cut expenses drastically to survive the crisis, and non-essential projects would be the first to fall. Eleanor found Griffin that night in the small apartment he had rented near the historic centre. He sat in darkness, with an untouched whiskey in hand, contemplating the illuminated colonial town through the window. "I know everything," she said softly. "Caleb works in accounting, remember?" Griffin nodded without turning. "We're going to lose everything, Eleanor." His voice sounded hollow, devoid of the confidence that always characterized it. "The project, the center, maybe even Nexus. Years of work destroyed by the greed of someone I trusted." Eleanor approached slowly and knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. "Remember what you told me when Grandma died? That we could build something new, something that truly mattered." Her eyes shone with an iron determination. "Well, maybe it's time to do it. For real." Griffin looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "That maybe Nexus, in its current form, has already fulfilled its purpose," she responded. "Maybe this crisis is actually an opportunity for us to completely reinvent ourselves." That night, seated on the apartment floor with papers spread around them, they traced an audacious plan. They wouldn't simply try to save Nexus, they would create something completely new from its ashes. A hybrid company that combined cutting-edge technology with traditional values, operating simultaneously from New York and Virginia, connecting worlds that rarely met. The following months were a whirlwind of frenetic activity. Griffin faced the crisis head-on. He fired the corrupt partner, collaborated fully with the authorities, implemented new transparency systems, and personally renegotiated with each important client. Eleanor, meanwhile, accelerated the development of the Millwood Center, transforming what was initially going to be just a regional headquarters into a true innovation hub. She recruited local talent, established alliances with regional universities, and created training programs for young people from rural areas. The transformation was painful. They had to cut staff, abandon projects, give up comforts. There were nights of doubt, days of frustration, moments when everything seemed lost. But little by little, something new began to emerge from the crisis. Clients who remained loyal became more committed. Employees who decided to stay despite the uncertainty demonstrated a loyalty no salary could buy. The rural communities connected through the program became their fiercest defenders. One afternoon, while supervising the installation of solar panels on the roof of the old store, Eleanor observed Griffin interact with local technicians. He wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, had hands stained with paint after helping restore some walls, and spoke with workers with a naturalness that radically contrasted with the image of the relentless CEO she had known in New York. "You're different," she commented when they were alone. "For better or worse?" he asked with a tired but genuine smile. "More real," she responded, intertwining her fingers with his. "As if you'd finally found yourself." Griffin contemplated the Virginia horizon, so different from the Manhattan skyscrapers among which he had built his original empire. "You know, my whole life I thought success meant building something big, impressive, that intimidated others," he reflected. "Now I realize that true success is building something that connects people, that improves real lives, that endures even when we're no longer here." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, feeling that despite all the chaos, the losses, and the uncertainty, they were exactly where they should be. "My grandmother would be proud," she murmured. "Of both of us." What they didn't know then was that the rebuilding they had initiated was just beginning, and that the most difficult tests for their relationship were yet to come. The seventh turning point arrived when the new Millwood Center was almost complete. Griffin had briefly returned to New York to finalize some legal aspects of Nexus's restructuring when he received an unexpected visit to his office. Olivia Blackwood, his ex-fiancée, appeared unannounced, as elegant and sophisticated as always. 5 years had passed since their breakup, since Griffin discovered she had been sharing confidential information with the competition while they planned their wedding. "Quite a makeover, Griffin," she commented, examining the office that now displayed a simpler and more functional style, far from the ostentatious luxury that had characterized it during their relationship. Midlife crisis or true transformation? Griffin maintained his composure, although her presence awakened painful memories he thought he had overcome. "What do you want, Olivia? I doubt you've come for the pleasure of my company." She smiled, a smile that once would have disarmed him. Always so direct. She sat down without waiting for an invitation. "I'm here to make you a proposal. Global Tech has hired me to direct their North American operations. They want to approach Nexus again under new terms." Griffin looked at her in disbelief. "After everything that happened, you think I would do business with you again?" "Business is business, Griffin," she responded coldly. "And we both know that Nexus needs this deal more than ever. I've seen the numbers. You're one step away from bankruptcy." The conversation that followed was tense, professional on the surface, but laden with personal subtexts. Olivia presented an offer that, although less spectacular than the original, was still extremely generous given Nexus's current circumstances. The only requirement: Griffin would have to refocus exclusively on technological development and abandon personal projects like rural connections. "It's a rescue, Griffin," Olivia finally said. "You know it's the most sensible thing." When she left, Griffin remained motionless in his office for a long time. The terms of the agreement danced in his mind along with memories of the past, doubts about the present, and fears about the future. It was true that Nexus's financial situation remained precarious. The new business model on which he and Eleanor were working required time to consolidate, time they might not have. That night he returned to Millwood later than usual. He found Eleanor on the center's terrace, surrounded by plans and samples of traditional materials they planned to use in the final decoration. "Bad day?" she asked, immediately recognizing the tension in his face. Griffin hesitated. Part of him wanted to protect her, to spare her the worry. Another part, the one that had learned to value honesty above all, knew he should share what had happened. "Olivia came to see me today," he finally said, observing how Eleanor's face tensed upon hearing that name she knew well from the stories he had told her. "She now represents Global Tech. They've presented a new offer." He explained the details, trying to remain objective, professional. But as he spoke, he noticed a shadow of disquiet settling in Eleanor's eyes. "What are you going to do?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know," he admitted with honesty. "Financially, it makes sense. It would give us the stability we need to survive. But it would mean abandoning rural connections." It wasn't a question. "Or at least significantly reducing it," he confirmed. "Concentrating on technological development, returning to basics." A heavy silence settled between them. It wasn't just a professional disagreement. It was their first true crisis as a couple, the first moment when their visions of the future seemed to diverge dangerously. "I thought we were building something different," Eleanor finally said, with a voice so controlled it revealed the effort it cost her to remain calm. "Something that wasn't measured only in terms of profitability." "And we are," Griffin responded. "But we also have responsibilities. Employees who depend on us, investors who trusted in my judgment." The discussion that followed was painful for both. There were no shouts or accusations, but something worse, a fundamental divergence of priorities that neither knew how to reconcile. When they finally separated that night, for the first time since their relationship had begun, an invisible but palpable distance had installed itself between them. The following days were tense. They continued working together, maintaining professional appearances, but the intimacy, the complicity they had built, seemed to have evaporated. Eleanor focused on finishing the center, as if she wanted to complete it before it was too late. Griffin spent more time in New York, analyzing options, seeking alternatives that could satisfy both the company's financial needs and the ideals that now formed an integral part of his vision. The eighth turning point came in the form of a letter. Eleanor found it one morning among papers that had been stored in the store's attic. It was an old yellowed missive, written with elegant calligraphy on quality paper that had resisted the passage of time. It was addressed to her grandmother, dated 1978, and signed by a name that left her breathless: Margaret Lancaster. The content of the letter shocked her even more. It was a communication between intimate friends, where the woman shared her concerns about her small son, Griffin, whom she was raising alone in Boston while working tirelessly to give him an education. "My little Griffin is so serious, so responsible for his age," she wrote. Sometimes I worry that he's assuming burdens too heavy for his childish shoulders. He tries to protect me, can you imagine? At 6 years old, he saves bread from his lunch so I can eat it when I come home exhausted from work. How can I explain to him that the only thing I wish is for him to be happy, to find something he loves beyond duty and responsibility? The letter continued detailing the friendship that had united both women during a summer when Margaret, then a young student from Boston, had worked as a waitress at the Harlow store to pay for her studies. She spoke of shared dreams, of the hope that their children might meet someday, of the certainty they would have been good friends. With trembling hands, Eleanor searched for more letters and found an entire correspondence that extended over years. The last one, written with a shakier handwriting, mentioned Margaret's terminal illness and her concern about her son's future. My greatest fear is that Griffin, in his eagerness to prove he can succeed where I failed economically, will forget to live, that he'll confuse success with happiness, that he'll build walls around his heart to protect himself. Vivian, if our paths ever cross again, remind him that the true legacy isn't in what we build, but in how we love. That night, when Griffin returned from New York, he found Eleanor waiting for him in the old store's yard, illuminated by lanterns that created an almost magical environment. On the stone table, the letters were carefully arranged. "I think there's something you need to see," she said softly. For the following hours, Griffin read each letter, each word written by the mother he had barely known. At times he had to stop, overwhelmed by emotion. Eleanor remained at his side, offering her silent presence as the only possible consolation. When he finished the last letter, Griffin looked up. There were tears in his eyes, but also a clarity that had been absent during the days of tension. "It seems destiny had plans for us long before we met," he said with a voice hoarse from emotion. "Your mother and my grandmother dreamed we would meet someday," Eleanor responded, taking his hand. "Perhaps they saw what we were destined to build together." Griffin looked at the letters, testimonies of a friendship that had transcended time and circumstances. "My mother was right," he murmured. "I've spent my entire life confusing success with happiness, building walls to protect myself, until you came along." That night, seated under the Virginia stars, surrounded by echoes of the past and possibilities of the future, they made a joint decision. They would reject Global Tech's offer. They would find another way to save Nexus, one that wouldn't compromise the values that now formed the core of their shared vision. "It won't be easy," Griffin warned. "We could lose everything." Eleanor smiled, a smile that contained all the determination of her Virginia heritage and all the tenderness she had learned to express since meeting him. "Or we could gain everything," she responded. "The things that truly matter." What neither of them knew then was that the letters found that night would be just the beginning of a deeper connection between their pasts, a connection that would give them the strength needed to face the most difficult test awaiting them. The rejection of Global Tech's offer provoked exactly the reaction they had feared. Investors who had remained loyal during the previous crisis began losing patience. The board of directors called an emergency meeting to question Griffin's leadership. Rumors about Nexus's imminent bankruptcy multiplied in New York's financial circles. Amid this whirlwind, Griffin and Eleanor remained firm in their decision. They redoubled their efforts at the Millwood Center, which finally opened its doors in a discreet but emotional ceremony. The building, which combined traditional Virginia architecture with cutting-edge technology, quickly became a symbol of their vision, a bridge between seemingly opposite worlds. The ninth turning point came unexpectedly. One morning, while Eleanor was coordinating a workshop with local artisans, she began feeling ill. Dizziness, nausea, and overwhelming fatigue she initially attributed to stress and long workdays. When she finally agreed to visit the doctor, after Griffin's insistence, the diagnosis left her breathless. Severe anemia requiring immediate treatment. Additional tests revealed a more complex problem, an autoimmune condition that explained her growing fatigue over recent months and would require prolonged treatment. It wasn't terminal, but it was chronic, an unwanted companion that would alter the course of her life. Fear consumed her, not for herself but for everything they had built together. What if she became a burden? What if Griffin, who already faced so many professional challenges, couldn't or wouldn't want to also take on this personal trial? For days, she tried to hide the gravity of her condition, minimizing symptoms, pretending to have energy she didn't have, gradually distancing herself with work excuses and invented commitments. Griffin noticed the change, of course. He knew her too well not to perceive that something fundamental had changed. One night, he confronted her in the small apartment they now shared in Millwood's historic center. "What's really happening, Eleanor?" he asked with gentleness but firmness. "And don't tell me it's just tiredness." She tried to maintain the facade, but under Griffin's patient and loving gaze, her defenses finally crumbled. Through tears, she confessed her diagnosis, the necessary treatments, the possible future scenarios, and finally her greatest fear. "I don't want to be a burden to you," she concluded with a broken voice. "You already have too many responsibilities, too much pressure. It wouldn't be fair to add this." Griffin listened in silence, his face a mask of calm that hid the inner storm. When she finished, he knelt before her and took her hands in his. "You stood by my side when I lost almost everything," he said with an intensity that made Eleanor hold her breath. "When my reputation was crumbling, when my decisions were questioned by everyone, when it seemed my career was over. Do you really believe I would abandon you now?" The simplicity of his response, the certainty in his voice, broke something inside Eleanor. The tears, contained for days out of pride and fear, flowed freely. "I'm afraid," she confessed, "of being weak, of not being able to continue with our projects, of disappointing you." "Listen to me well," Griffin interrupted, cradling her face in his hands. "You are the strongest person I've ever known, and if a day comes when you need to lean on me, it will be an honor to be your strength, just as you've been mine." The following months were a trial by fire for their relationship. The treatment left Eleanor exhausted, with good days and terrible days. There were moments of frustration, of helplessness, of anger against a body that seemed to have rebelled at the worst possible moment. Griffin completely reorganized his life to be present without being suffocating. He learned about her condition, accompanied her to every medical appointment, adapted his schedules to share the center's responsibilities when she couldn't do so. On particularly difficult days when Eleanor couldn't get out of bed, he read her poems by Walt Whitman or told her stories of his childhood in Boston. One afternoon, while she rested after an especially exhausting treatment session, Griffin received a call that would change the course of their story. It was from a small artisanal honey producer from a nearby town, one of the first to join the Rural Connections program. His product had been selected to represent the United States at a prestigious international gastronomy fair in Tokyo. The news could have been simply positive, but what followed was extraordinary. The beekeeper explained that thanks to the contacts facilitated by the program, he had received orders from Japanese importers, Michelin-starred chefs, and gourmet distributors from 3 continents. His small family production, which before barely reached the local market, now had global demand. And it wasn't an isolated case. In the following weeks, similar stories began arriving from different parts of the country. Appalachian quilters receiving orders from designers in Milan, artisanal cider producers from Vermont collaborating with renowned chefs, pottery makers from New Mexico distributing to boutiques in New York. What had begun as a social responsibility project was demonstrating an economic potential that no one, not even its fiercest defenders, had completely foreseen. Rural Connections wasn't just preserving traditions in danger of extinction, it was creating a new economic model where authenticity and artisanal quality became competitive advantages in global markets saturated with industrial products. The effect on Nexus was immediate. The same investors who had questioned Griffin's vision now wanted to increase their participation. Technology companies that had previously refused collaborations now sought alliances. Specialized media that had published premature obituaries for Nexus now wrote about its revolutionary hybrid approach. One afternoon, while reviewing the surprisingly positive figures from the last quarter, Eleanor observed Griffin with a mixture of pride and amazement. "You did it," she said softly. "Against all odds." He shook his head. "We did it together," he corrected. "Your vision, my structure. Your heart, my head. Separately, neither of us would have come this far." It was true. Eleanor's illness, which initially seemed a catastrophe, had forced both to find a more sustainable balance. She had learned to delegate, to trust the team they had formed, to accept she couldn't and didn't need to control everything. He had discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that showing compassion didn't diminish his authority, that the most important decisions were rarely purely rational or emotional, but a complex amalgamation of both. One night, while they were dining on the terrace of their shared apartment, Griffin briefly disappeared and returned with a small, hand-carved wooden box. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, intrigued. "Open it and find out," he responded with an enigmatic smile. Inside, on a bed of blue velvet, was a simple silver ring with a single sunflower engraved on it. "It's not a diamond," Griffin apologized. "I know traditionally it should be something more—" "It's perfect," she interrupted, with tears of emotion glistening in her eyes. "Sunflowers always seek the light, even on the darkest days." Griffin took her hand with delicacy. "Like us," he said softly. "We've weathered storms that should have destroyed us, but we've always found a way to turn toward the light." He didn't ask the traditional question. Instead, he repeated those first words that had changed the course of their lives. "I promise to go slowly," he said, with an emotion that made his voice slightly tremble. "I promise to value every second with you, never to rush the important moments, to build our life stone by stone." Eleanor, with tears flowing freely down her cheeks, completed the circle with her response. "What if I don't know how to follow your pace?" Griffin smiled, recognizing the echo of that first moment of connection. "Then I'll stop until we're ready to walk together," he responded, sealing the promise with a kiss that contained all the path traveled and all that still lay ahead. News of the engagement spread quickly among friends and family, but both decided to postpone plans for a formal wedding until Eleanor's health stabilized. They didn't need ceremonies or papers to confirm what they already knew, that they had found in each other a connection that transcended conventional definitions. The following months brought good news on multiple fronts. Eleanor's treatment began showing positive results, allowing her to gradually recover energy and vitality. Nexus consolidated itself as a pioneer in a new business model that combined advanced technology with traditional values. And the Millwood Center became an international reference for rural innovation, attracting visitors from Silicon Valley to Tokyo. The 10th turning point came in the form of an unexpected proposal. The state government of Virginia offered Griffin and Eleanor the possibility of acquiring extensive land in an area near Charlottesville, where old farms had been abandoned during the rural exodus of previous decades. The idea was to transform them into a large-scale innovation campus, a space where tradition and technology could coexist and cross-pollinate. The opportunity was perfect, but overwhelming. It would mean a definitive commitment to Virginia, moving even further from the New York corporate world that had been Griffin's professional home for decades. It would also mean a considerable personal and emotional investment at a time when Eleanor's health, though improved, remained unpredictable. "Are you sure you want to take this step?" she asked one afternoon as they walked the land in question. "New York has always been your world. Here you'll be 4 hours away from everything you know." Griffin contemplated the landscape stretching before them, gentle hills covered with native vegetation, fields that in spring would be covered with wildflowers, the Blue Ridge Mountains outlining against Virginia's intensely blue sky. "You know what's strange?" he finally responded. "That I've never felt so at home as I do here. In New York I built an empire, but I always felt like a visitor, as if I were playing a role." He took Eleanor's hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, in a gesture that had become natural between them. "Here I can simply be," he continued, "without expectations, without appearances to maintain. Free." The decision was made. During the following months, they worked tirelessly on developing the project. Architects, engineers, sustainability specialists, local artisans, all contributed to giving shape to a vision that seemed impossible on paper, but was gradually beginning to materialize. Griffin sold his luxury penthouse in Manhattan, the most exclusive neighborhood in New York, and personally invested in buying an old stone house in the outskirts of Charlottesville. It was a century-old construction with thick walls that kept coolness in summer and warmth in winter. Inner courtyards where the water from a small fountain created a constant murmur, and panoramic views of the Virginia plateau. Adapting to rural life brought moments of involuntary comedy. Griffin, accustomed to urban efficiency, found himself facing unexpected challenges, from learning to correctly light the wood stove to understanding nature's rhythms. His first encounter with the chickens that freely roamed the yard was particularly memorable, as was his genuine terror when a young bull chased him during a local fair. Eleanor observed these moments with a mixture of amusement and tenderness, seeing how the powerful businessman who had intimidated international executives now struggled to understand the complexities of rural life. His first attempt at growing heirloom tomatoes was an absolute disaster that ended with the entire Harlow family rushing to the rescue. But with each day, with each small failure, and each small triumph, Griffin transformed. The tense man, always alert, perpetually connected to electronic devices, gave way to someone more relaxed, more present, more capable of enjoying simple moments. One spring morning, Eleanor woke to find the bed empty beside her. Concerned, she quickly dressed and went out to look for Griffin. She found him in a field near the house, working under the early sun. He wore worn jeans and a simple t-shirt, had dirt on his hands and sweat on his forehead, but his eyes shone with a satisfaction he rarely showed after closing the most lucrative deals. "What are you doing?" she asked, approaching. Griffin looked up, smiling. He had dirt on his hands and sweat on his forehead, but his eyes shone with a satisfaction he rarely showed after closing the most lucrative deals. "Planting sunflowers," he responded simply. Eleanor looked around. What had before been vacant land now showed perfect rows of small furrows where newly planted seeds waited for their moment to grow. "This entire field?" she asked, astonished by the extent of the work. "How long have you been out here?" "Since dawn," he admitted. "I wanted it to be a surprise." "Why sunflowers?" she asked, moved by the gesture whose meaning she intuited but wanted to hear from his lips. Griffin stood up, cleaning his hands on his jeans with a naturalness the former CEO would have found unthinkable. "Because they're like us," he responded with simplicity, "always seeking the light even on the darkest days. And because I wanted to create something beautiful for you, something that symbolized everything we've built together." In that moment, under the growing sun of Virginia, with his hands calloused from work he had never thought he would dedicate himself to, Griffin seemed younger, freer, more authentic than ever. "There's something else," he added with a mysterious smile. "But you'll have to wait until summer to see it." The months passed quickly, filled with work on the new campus, and in the house they were gradually transforming into a home. Eleanor continued with her treatment, experiencing gradual improvements that allowed her to take on more responsibilities, though always within the limits they had learned to respect. Finally, on a golden July afternoon, when the sun began its lazy descent toward the horizon, Griffin blindfolded Eleanor and carefully guided her outside the house. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, laughing as she advanced blindly. "Patience," he responded, guiding her with gentleness. "Some surprises deserve the wait." They walked for several minutes until Griffin finally stopped her. "Ready?" he asked, his voice vibrating with barely contained emotion. When he removed the blindfold from her eyes, Eleanor was breathless. Before her stretched a spectacle that seemed drawn from a dream. The entire field of sunflowers had bloomed, creating a sea of living gold that gently undulated with the breeze. But the most surprising thing was the pattern. Seen from the hill where they stood, the sunflowers formed legible words, "I will love you slowly." In the center of the field, a small wooden gazebo rose like an island in the yellow ocean. Griffin had built the structure with his own hands over weeks, working at dawn and dusk, to maintain the surprise. "It's not perfect," he apologized, pointing to the slightly crooked angles and visible imperfections. "It turns out building things is harder than it looks in YouTube videos." Eleanor couldn't contain the tears of emotion. The beauty of the gesture, the effort it represented, the vulnerability of this man who had once been defined by his relentless perfectionism and who now took pride in an imperfect creation made with love, it all overwhelmed her. Griffin took her by the hand and led her along a small path between the sunflowers to the gazebo. There, surrounded by the soft murmur of flowers moving with the wind and bathed in the golden light of the Virginia sunset, he knelt before her. "I promise to go slowly," he said, repeating those words that had marked the beginning of their story. "I promise to value every second with you, never to rush the important moments, to build our life together with the same patience with which I've planted each of these sunflowers." He took out a small wooden box, similar to the one that had contained the engagement ring, but this time it enclosed two simple bands. "We don't need a formal ceremony or signed papers to seal what we already know," he continued. "Here, before this field we've cultivated together, I ask you to be my companion, my equal, my anchor, and my adventure for the rest of our lives." Eleanor took his face between her hands, seeing in him the boy who had saved bread for his tired mother, the ambitious young man who had built an empire to prove his worth, the vulnerable man who had learned to love without fear. "Yes," she responded simply, "because some truths are so deep they need no adornment. There as the sun painted the sky in oranges and purples, they sealed their commitment with a kiss that contained all the path traveled, from that first meeting in a glass office to this field of sunflowers in Virginia. A journey neither of them would have imagined, but which seemed in retrospect as inevitable as the turning of sunflowers toward the light. The Rural Innovation Campus finally opened its doors in the fall, coinciding with the apple harvest in nearby orchards. The contrast was perfect. While local farmers harvested fruit following centuries-old methods, young programmers from across the country settled into ultra-modern spaces designed to foster creativity and collaboration. The inauguration attracted international attention. Specialized media, politicians of different tendencies, curious entrepreneurs, all wanted to see firsthand the experiment that challenged established conventions about where and how innovation was created in the 21st century. Eleanor and Griffin toured the facilities with barely disguised pride, explaining the philosophy behind each decision, from the architecture that respected the natural environment to the educational programs designed to empower local communities. They had created something truly unique, a space where authenticity wasn't considered an obstacle to innovation, but its most valuable source. The 11th turning point came during the celebration following the inauguration. Among the crowd of guests, an elderly man with a tired but dignified appearance observed Griffin from a distance. When he finally approached, Eleanor noticed how her husband visibly tensed. "Son," the man said simply, with a marked Boston accent. "Father," Griffin responded, his voice carefully neutral. Nearly 8 years had passed since they last saw each other, after a bitter argument about the pressures his father had exerted during Griffin's childhood. Pressures that, although born from love and the desire to see him succeed, had left deep scars. The silence between them was dense, laden with unspoken words, silenced reproaches, postponed apologies. Eleanor was preparing to discreetly withdraw when Griffin, surprising her, took her hand firmly. "I want to introduce you to someone," he said to his father. "This is Eleanor, my wife, and the person who taught me that true success has nothing to do with what we believed." The conversation that followed was uncomfortable at first, full of silences and carefully avoided topics. But as the night progressed, as they toured together the facilities Griffin and Eleanor had created, something began to change. His father observed with amazement not just the project itself, but the evident transformation in his son, the way he interacted with locals, the passion with which he spoke about sustainability and purpose, the way he looked at Eleanor as if she were the compass he had found when he was most lost. In a moment of intimacy, while Eleanor conversed with other guests, father and son found themselves alone before a century-old oak tree they had preserved in the center of the campus. "Your mother would be proud," the elderly man said, breaking the silence. "She always knew you were more than numbers and ambitions." Griffin felt something loosen inside his chest, a knot he had carried for so long it had become part of him. "Why did you never talk to me about her?" he finally asked, giving voice to a question he had kept for decades, about what she was really like, what she dreamed of, what she loved. His father lowered his gaze, his hands calloused from physical work, nervously twisting the edge of his jacket. "Because it hurt too much," he admitted with a broken voice. "Because every time I saw her eyes in yours, I felt I was failing the promise I made to her to raise you as she would have wanted. And I ended up becoming what I feared most, someone who saw in you an extension of himself, not a separate person with your own dreams." That night marked the beginning of a gradual reconciliation. There were no grand declarations or melodramatic embraces, just small steps toward rebuilding a relationship both had believed irreparable. In the following months, Harrison Lancaster became a frequent visitor to the campus. At 70 years old, he found an unexpected purpose teaching traditional carpentry techniques to young digital designers, creating an intergenerational bridge that perfectly symbolized the place's philosophy. Meanwhile, the field of sunflowers that Griffin had planted became an annual tradition. Each spring he sowed new seeds, experimenting with different patterns and messages. What had begun as a romantic gesture transformed into a local symbol, attracting visitors who wanted to contemplate the spectacle when the flowers reached their fullness in summer. The 12th turning point came unexpectedly one winter morning, as Eleanor returned from her quarterly checkup in Charlottesville. Her doctor, disconcerted and emotional in equal parts, had given her news she herself didn't dare fully believe. She was pregnant. Given her medical history and the medication she took to control her autoimmune condition, specialists had always been cautious regarding her chances of conceiving. The news, although wonderful, brought with it legitimate concerns about how pregnancy would affect her already compromised health. When she arrived home, she found Griffin in his small office, reviewing plans for the campus expansion. Seeing her in the doorway with an indecipherable expression, he immediately put aside what he was doing. "What did the doctor say?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Eleanor approached slowly, still processing the reality of what she was about to share. "I'm pregnant," she finally said, the words suspended in the air between them like a promise and a challenge simultaneously. Griffin looked at her fixedly, a cascade of emotions crossing his face: surprise, joy, fear, hope. And then, to Eleanor's surprise, the always controlled Griffin Lancaster broke into tears. They weren't silent or discreet tears, but deep sobs that seemed to emerge from a primordial place within him. The reaction disconcerted Eleanor, who knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. "I thought you'd be happy." "I'm terrified," he confessed between tears. "What if I don't know how to be a father? What if I make the same mistakes? What if something happens to you during the pregnancy? What if—" Eleanor placed a finger on his lips, stopping the torrent of fears. "Listen to me well," she said with firmness. "You will make mistakes, yes. All parents do, but you'll also love this child with every fiber of your being, and that's what truly matters." She took Griffin's hand and placed it on her belly, still flat, but now containing a life they had both created. "This baby will have what you didn't. Two parents who love each other, who have learned to be vulnerable, who understand that real success has nothing to do with external achievements." The months of pregnancy were an emotional roller coaster. Eleanor's condition required constant monitoring, adjustments in medications, frequent visits to specialists in Charlottesville. There were moments of fear, nights of insomnia, where the worst scenarios were drawn in their minds. But there was also profound joy, anticipation, a sense of purpose that transcended even the professional achievements they had built together. Griffin transformed during this period. The man who had once managed teams of hundreds of people with relentless efficiency now dedicated hours to researching fetal development, natural birth techniques, respectful parenting theories. He personally installed the crib in the room that would be the baby's, painted murals on the walls, and spent each night reading aloud to Eleanor's increasingly prominent belly, convinced that his son or daughter should familiarize themselves from the beginning with Hemingway, Thoreau, and Maya Angelou. The room that had been designated as the nursery perfectly reflected the fusion of their worlds. Artisanal furniture created by local carpenters, monitoring technology developed at the campus, traditional Virginia toys alongside cutting-edge educational devices. The climax of their story came on a spring night, when contractions began unexpectedly, 2 weeks before the due date. The road to the Charlottesville hospital never seemed so long, with Griffin driving with a mixture of controlled panic and fierce determination. The birth was complicated due to Eleanor's condition. Hours of labor, moments of crisis where monitors showed concerning signs, medical decisions made in seconds that seemed to contain eternities. Griffin remained by her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, being the anchor she needed when pain threatened to sweep her away. And finally, when dawn began to filter its golden light through the hospital windows, the vigorous cry of a new life filled the room. A small but perfect girl, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's evident determination even in her first minutes of life. When they placed her in Eleanor's arms, exhausted but radiant, Griffin felt something fundamental change within him. It wasn't a gradual change, like so many others in his life, but an instantaneous and absolute transformation. Looking at that small creature, fragile and powerful simultaneously, He finally understood what his mother had tried to teach him through her sacrifices, that unconditional love is the only force capable of giving true meaning to existence. "Vivian," Eleanor whispered, looking at her daughter and then at Griffin. "Vivian Margaret Lancaster Harlow." Griffin nodded, unable to speak from the emotion that closed his throat. The names honored the two women who, without knowing each other, had been fundamental in their story. The grandmother who had raised Eleanor with unbreakable love, and the mother who had sacrificed everything to give him a future. In that moment, holding his family in his arms, Griffin finally understood the promise he had made years ago. "I promised to go slowly" wasn't simply a romantic commitment. It was a philosophy of life. It was understanding that the most valuable moments cannot and should not be rushed, that building something meaningful requires patience and presence, that true love is cultivated day by day, like a field of sunflowers that requires constant attention to flourish. 5 years later, the field of sunflowers had become a local attraction. Each summer, when the flowers reached their maximum splendor, entire families came to contemplate the spectacle and guess what new message Griffin had designed for that year. On this occasion, a small girl with dark hair and curious eyes ran among the golden flowers, laughing as her father chased her, pretending he couldn't catch her. Vivian, having just turned 5, had inherited her mother's determination and her father's intensity, combined with a contagious joy that was entirely her own. Eleanor observed them from the hill, seated in the shade of a century-old oak tree. Her health, though never completely recovered, had stabilized enough to allow her to fully enjoy these moments. The rural innovation campus they had created together prospered beyond their initial expectations, attracting talent and investment to a region that had once been a symbol of rural abandonment. As she watched her family playing among sunflowers, she recalled the long road that had brought them to this point. From that first meeting in the glass office in New York, where spilled coffee had changed the course of their destinies, to the birth of their daughter. A path full of challenges, losses, moments of doubt, but also of discoveries, unexpected joys, and profound transformations. Griffin finally caught Vivian, lifting her in his arms as she laughed out loud. At 43, he was a completely different man from the relentless executive she had met 6 years ago. The grey hair beginning to appear at his temples, the lines of expression around his eyes, the occasional twinge in his back after carrying his daughter. None of these signs of the passage of time seemed to bother him. On the contrary, he carried them with the tranquility of one who has found a purpose that transcends superficial vanities. When they joined Eleanor under the oak tree, Vivian immediately curled up in her mother's lap, asking for the story of the coffee and the sunflowers, her favorite before nap time. It was a ritual they never tired of repeating, telling their daughter, with words adapted to her age, the story of how they had met and all the trials they had overcome to be together. "And then, Daddy planted an entire field of sunflowers for Mommy," Griffin narrated with a melodious voice as the little girl fought against sleep. "Because sunflowers always seek the light, even on cloudy days. Like us." "And why did you promise to go slowly?" asked Vivian, asking the same question she asked each time, as if wanting to ensure the answer remained the same. Griffin looked at Eleanor, finding in her eyes the same tranquil and deep love that had grown between them, with each challenge overcome, with each joy shared, with each everyday moment transformed into sacred by the simple decision to be fully present in it. "Because the most important things in life should not be rushed," he responded, stroking his daughter's hair as she finally yielded to sleep. "Building something that lasts, truly loving someone, raising a child, sowing a field of sunflowers, all these things require patience, attention, and the willingness to be present in each small moment." When Vivian fell asleep, Griffin and Eleanor remained silent, enjoying the peace of the moment. In the distance, the campus buzzed with activity. Students from across the country collaborating with local artisans, cutting-edge technology being applied to ancestral problems, traditions preserved through respectful innovations. "You know what I was thinking?" Eleanor finally said, her voice barely a whisper so as not to wake the child. "What?" he asked, intertwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that, after so many years, continued to transmit security and connection. "That in the end, it wasn't about finding the perfect balance between your world and mine," she responded, contemplating the Virginia landscape that stretched before them. It was about creating a completely new world together. Griffin smiled, recognizing the profound truth in her words. They hadn't simply merged their previous lives. They had built something entirely original, something that wouldn't have been possible if either had tried to simply absorb the other into their pre-existing reality. "And we continue creating it every day," he added, softly kissing his wife's forehead. As the sun began its lazy descent on the Virginia horizon, bathing the field of sunflowers with a golden light that seemed to emerge from within the flowers themselves, both contemplated in silence the message Griffin had designed for that year, now visible from their elevated position. "True love is patient." It wasn't an original phrase or especially poetic, but it contained the hard-won wisdom of two people who had learned through trials and tribulations that the deepest truths are often the simplest. That authentic love isn't a destination one reaches, but a path one consciously travels, day after day, choice after choice. As Vivian slept peacefully between them, living symbol of their union, Griffin and Eleanor silently renewed the promise that had defined their story, to continue advancing together, mutually adapting their pace, always finding the balance between their strengths and weaknesses, allowing themselves to grow individually without losing themselves as a couple. And in that perfectly ordinary and simultaneously extraordinary moment, under the shade of a century-old oak tree, with the distant murmur of a campus that united tradition and innovation, surrounded by a sea of sunflowers that always sought the light, both understood they had found something few have the privilege to experience, a love that transforms not only those who live it, but that expands to change the world around it. True love doesn't consist of making grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It builds itself in everyday spaces, in small but constant decisions to choose each other, to support each other in darkness and celebrate in light. And above all, it consists in the courage to go slowly in a world that always pushes us to run.